This lecture will look specifically at Consumer Price Index, which is probably the next largest measurement of inflation besides gross domestic product. So let's get to it. So the definition of a cost of living is sort of the amount of money needed to sustain a certain standard of living by looking at the estimated cost of housing, food, taxes, items such as that. And when we talk about a standard of living, we're talking about sort of the material well-being of the average person in a given population. So if we look at sort of presidents, and that's why I have this up here for you to look at, we can look at how much these presidents are being paid. And the question is what would their standard of living be like today compared to what they were then? Meaning is that if we take George Washington's $25,000 that he earned, what would his current level of standard of living be based on what his standard of living was back then? So in today's value, it would be more like he made $743,000 of purchasing power, meaning is that his $25,000 back in 1789 allowed him to buy as much housing and land and food and pay taxes as somebody in 2021 who made $743,000. So we would say is that $1 back in 1789 would be equal to basically almost $30 today in 2021. So let's take a look at another president. We'll look at Theodore Roosevelt. He's one who was making $50,000 as president. And notice that his $50,000 salary would equal somebody who was being paid over $1.5 million today. He was able to buy with his $50,000 in 1901 the same amount of stuff that somebody today who is making $1.53 million would able to pay. So basically a dollar in 1901 would be equal to, again, almost $30 today. But why the big difference? Well, George Washington was paid half the amount of money that Theodore Roosevelt was paid. So he has a lot more money in the first place. He's doubled basically his income. And if you look at the value of purchasing power, it almost doubled also. What about his cousin Franklin, who was paid $75,000? Well, he's also $1.5 million, but notice here now the value of that dollar has gone down a little bit compared to Theodore and George. And that's because we're getting closer to today's value. But still, $1.5 million is a lot of buying power. If most of you had $1.5 million of salary every year, you would have a very different standard of living than you have now. So you can think of that Franklin Roosevelt had a very different standard of living from the salary that he made compared to what you have. What about as we get closer? JFK is a very popularly known president. He's 1961. Now notice it starts to go down. It's now $800,000, or 807, almost $900,000. But really, it's that dollar amount, the one-to-one amount. You see a dramatic decrease from $20 to $8.75. So basically, $1 in 1961, what it could buy you would be the same amount as $8.75 today could. So in one way, I think of this as sort of going to a fast food restaurant. You might buy a meal for $8.75 today at many fast food restaurants. Back in 1961, that same meal may have only cost you $1. Ronald Reagan is pretty close. Now, he was at the $200,000 mark, and basically we see, again, a pretty dramatic decrease. It's not really a decrease as much as the fact we have to realize that they're getting closer and closer to today's dollar value. So we only see that $1 in 1981 would buy the same as $2.88 today. We could even look at someone as close as Barack Obama, and we can see that there we have a small shift. So back in 2008, $1 in 2008 would buy you what $1.21 would buy you today. And many people who are listening to this were alive in 2008 and know that candy bars were maybe $1. And today, if I go to the store, that same candy bar is $1.25. The candy bar has not changed shape or size or amount, but the price has gone up. So that's a great example. Now, one thing I will ask you is, as you look at all the different names that are on here and think about all the different prices of people, which president actually based only on the salary of their presidential history, I guess, would be making the most money today? William McKinley. Yes, that famous president, William McKinley. Actually, if we were to take his $50,000 salary in 1897, today he would be able to buy basically what somebody who made 1.57 in salary could buy. So he had the highest purchasing power, you might want to say, based on all the presidents. When we look at sort of the standard of living and the cost of living comparison of his day versus today. So there's your piece of trivia. But he's going to come back later in our conversations. So let's move on. So there's some definitions we definitely want to make sure you know as you move through macroeconomics. In some cases, people have already had these things defined. In some cases, they haven't. So I'm just one of those ones who want to make sure that we're on the same page as we move through sort of our exploration of macroeconomics. So the first one is inflation. So inflation is basically officially as price levels go up that cause a purchase power decline. Now, it has to have that purchase power decline to have inflation. So if my price levels go up, but I can still buy the same amount, then it's not inflation. So we'll use that candy bar example. If I'm being paid $1 an hour and candy bars are $1, then there's no inflation. But if next year I'm still being paid $1 an hour, but candy bars go to $1.25, I can now purchase less candy bars than I could before. In fact, maybe I can't even purchase a candy bar. So my purchase power has gone down. The inflation, the prices increase, did not go along with an increase in my income. But if my income went up to $1.25 an hour and the candy bars went up to $1.25 an hour, then there's no inflation because I still have the same amount of purchasing power that I had before. We can also have deflation, which is basically the opposite, where basically my salary may go up, but the prices could decline, or my salary could stay the same, but prices decline. Now, you might think deflation is a really good thing, and a little bit of deflation is always a good thing, but we'll learn later on that too much deflation can be a bad thing. Just like too much inflation is not a good thing, too much deflation can be a bad thing. Why? Because if companies can't make money, if they're losing money, they're going to start laying off people. And as we begin to lay off people, then there's going to be less and less people with employment, and we're going to see sort of an economy begin to fall apart. So think of it like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. We want a little inflation, a little deflation. We want something right in between, not too much of either. The inflation rate then is the measurement of that change. So it's the measurement of the price differences and the purchase power. And so we come up with a rate of inflation from year to year. Now notice one of the things I do put in here is that it's about a specific time period and it's usually monthly or yearly. Occasionally we talk about inflation rates over very long periods of time, but generally not, because the standard of living's changed so much. I mean, we can think about George Washington, and yes, we say that he had a lot of purchasing power for his time frame, but in his time frame they didn't have cars. So, how do we really compare that inflationary rate? Well, what we can do is we can look at things like land and houses, and we can look at the purchasing power of those items. But that's why most of the time when we talk about inflation rates, it's usually a shorter time period rather than a very long time period. With an index, now the reason I put the word index up here is that we talk a lot about different indexes, but I often find that people don't know what an index is or how do we define the word index. In this case, one of the things is that it is a statistical measurement, meaning that we're looking at data, and we're looking at data that allows us to get some sort of analysis from this. And so we've got a group of what they say individual data points. So we might look at salary ranges for a group of people, or we might look at the price of cattle over a group of times. We look at something and we're able to take those and look at the changes, and those changes then allow us to do some analysis to gauge change, meaning is how much change do we really have. This way what we're talking about is we're not just using our gut. I feel like prices have gone up. No, the question is did prices go up, and if so, by how much? So indexes help us make that sort of analysis, and the index that we're going to be talking about a lot here is the Consumer Price Index, or the CPI. Now, the definition you see here comes directly from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. Yeah, that little thing up here. Now, the reason I put this one in is because it is the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics that calculates CPI. I figure since they're the ones who calculate CPI, their definition is probably the best one out there. If you've never visited their website and you really want true up-to-date information that doesn't have any bias to it, meaning is that you haven't heard anybody put their twist on it, go to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. They publish everything out to the free to the world to see. They don't hide anything. They'll tell you what they used and how they used it, and then you can make up your individual minds. So we're going to be using a lot of the data that comes directly from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or BLS, to help us understand sort of macroeconomics. So let's move on to actually talking about Consumer Price Index. Again, going straight to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, who calculates CPI, I do think it's interesting for students to understand that CPI is classified into many different groups, and different CPIs can be reported out there to the public. The 200 categories by 8 major groups are one that you can see people use in individual CPIs. So if we just want to understand housing, and they're talking about housing trends, they're going to use just the CPI on housing. And that is something that in 2008 was really looked at as we saw the housing bubble burst. You also can see down here that we talk about that CPI is divided into sort of 3 sort of structural ways. This one down here, we talk about durable versus non-durable goods. So the difference between things like a car versus a haircut. Also, one of the ones to really look at is the second one here, because we call this the core CPI. Things like food and energy, they have a lot of volatility in the cost of those things. So in Florida this year, we didn't have much freeze. It was actually a very pleasant winter. I kind of think winter skipped us this year. Now, because winter skipped us, that means that a lot of the fruit crops that we have grown more than they normally do, and there's going to be more strawberries produced, more this produced, more that produced, and they're going to be of very high quality, which is going to bring the cost of those fruits and vegetables down. And other years when we have really big freezes here in Florida, there's less fruits and vegetables available, and those costs go up highly. So we call that very volatile because the changes occur a lot. But if we take food and energy out of the CPI, then we're going to be talking about things like your washing machines, and we're going to be talking about things like your houses or medical care or recreation costs, and those are less volatile. So we're going to really see maybe true inflationary trends happening there, because as we see washing machines and medical costs and recreational costs go up, they tend to go up and never come back down. We don't tend to see Disney discounting their tickets all of a sudden after years of increasing the prices. No, they're going to keep them maintaining prices, but they don't go back down. Whereas food prices and energy prices, they go up and down and up and down. So we do have different types of CPIs. Again, really good place to get some good knowledge on this is the U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics. But let's move on to talk about what does go into the calculations of CPI. So our definition of CPI asks us about sort of the average change of a basket of goods. And how we calculate this is using this formula up here. But let's walk through this formula, because first of all, we need to understand what a given year is and what a base is. So we're going to use Maya over here. Maya is a working mom, and in 2011, she went shopping. And this is her basket of goods. And in 2011, that basket of goods cost her $800. Now, in 2021, she goes out and buys that same basket of goods, and now that same basket of goods costs her $2,000. So we now have a difference between prices. Well, first of all, let's talk about a base. Now, a base in this case is always going to be a 100 because we've just said that our base year is going to be 2011. So we're going to base everything off of the cost of goods in 2011, which was $800. And so if we use this formula, the given year was 2011, and the base was 2011 times 100, it's always 100. So I put this out there just so you always understand why they use 100 as basically the number for a base year. You'll quite often see when you're looking at statistical stuff from the U.S. Bureau of Labor that they'll say something like base equals 100. Meaning is that all their calculations, anytime they talk about a difference, they're basing it from this location. So it's not only important to understand that base is always 100, but also what the base year is. And later on in this lecture, we're going to show little differences by how calculating with different base years are going to give us different outcomes. But continuing on with this one, and we want to figure out what the CPI is that for 2021 based on 2011 prices, what we're going to do is take the formula and fill in the numbers. So we know that it costs $2,000. That's the given year right here, $2,000. And we're going to divide it based on the base. The base was 800 because we're using 2011. And we know that our CPI is 250. What this means is basically compared to 2011, prices have gone up by 250%. So what we have is a basket of goods that was $100 basically in 2011 would now cost $250 in 2021. So we've seen a pretty big increase in prices over those 10 years. But sometimes we really want to understand what the inflation rate is. So if we're going to understand the inflation rate, we have to measure it change from a previous period. This is basically a pretty long period of time when we start talking about the base year to the given year in this particular example, because our base year is 2011 and our basket of goods is 2021. That's a 10-year difference. And we just talked about that generally when we talk about inflation rates, we're talking about a monthly or yearly basically difference. So what we're going to do is let's say that our basket in 2020, the same basket of goods, cost $1,400. So now we're measuring from last year, 2020, to this year, 2021. So our current CPI was 250. What is our initial CPI? Well, we can figure out what the initial CPI was because remember, we know what our base year was because we know our base was 800. So our initial CPI is 175 because we're measuring from 2020 to 2021. And basically, we can do that little quick subtraction, little gimmo here, and we get 43%. So basically, there's been a big change between 2020 and 2021 of about 43%. So that would say that the inflation rate went up dramatically between those 2 years. Now, generally, inflation rates are not that high, but you know, nice to have big, large, and easy to divide numbers. As I always say in economics as a teacher, we like to make our numbers easy. We see inflation rates more generally around 2, 3, 4%. When we start getting into really high inflation rates, we're really talking about economic downturns. But for this example, it just allows you to kind of see the numbers and how they play out. The truth is today, most students don't hand calculate these things. You might be requested to do this on a test, but we're going to go out to websites, and websites are going to already have these calculators for you. Or you can go right to the Bureau of Labor Statistics that has already calculated this for you. And for most people, that's really the way you're going to get this information. So why do we present this to you or why have I presented this to you? It's because you should understand what goes behind the numbers. One of the things that people kind of keep forgetting is the base year. You need to really understand what year they're comparing this to, because depending on the year will make a great difference in what we see as far as our numbers are concerned. I mean, I didn't use a 10-year span for inflation because the truth is that 250%, there's all kinds of things that have changed in those 10 years. And we're going to talk about some of the problems about using CPI actually as a calculator for standard of living and costs of changes. Well, it's time to revisit President McKinley's salary and purchasing power. The question is, how did we determine this? How is this known? I also want to use this as an example of not only how do we figure this out, but the power of the base year, how the base year can shape how we look at these numbers. So basically the formula for this is just taking the dollar amount that you're looking at. So we could put 50,000 in, or I tend to use $1 to help us understand exactly the difference between a dollar then versus a dollar today. And we're going to look at the price levels of today. So what is today's CPI divided by the level of the year being measured from, the CPI of the base year. And so that base year then again comes into play. So for the one that you're seeing here, I went to the Official Data Foundation, which has a really good CPI calculator, and I used the information that they have there. Now, their base year is $2013, and that's one of the things that's, again, important to know. So based on $2013, they calculated that in 1897, the CPI would be 8.3, and based on $2013, 2021, your CPI was 261. And so simply putting that into the formula, you would say that $1 today would be equal to $31.52 from 1897. I'm determined to say 19, so I apologize on that one. But what if we use a different data source? So in this case, I went to the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. Now, notice that they're using their base year of 1967 versus 2013, and their CPIs are different. Now, they're different because their base years are different. And we saw when we looked at the presidents that the closer we got to the current year, the smaller the CPI. So because we're using 2013 here, we see some real differences. But how much is that really difference when we put it into the formula? So when we calculate it, if we use the one from the Bank of Minneapolis, the Federal Reserve, we would see that $1 would equal $30.73 in purchasing power compared to $31.52. So there's a slight difference between them. And if we were to calculate how much would that difference be on $50,000, it's basically about 3%. So just almost $40,000. Now, you and I might say, wow, $40,000 is a big difference. But really, if you're making more than $1.5 million a year, do you think $40,000 is really going to be that much noticeable? Probably not. But to the average person, $40,000 may seem like a lot. But we're talking about, based on over $1.5 million. So base years will make a difference, and depending on the base year that you use, you could get different amounts. Now, the other reason I bring this forward is that I have watched people have arguments over stuff, and this is right and this is right. And when I go back and I take a look, one of the problems is that they're using different base years. So they're both correct. They are both absolutely correct, because they're comparing apples and oranges. And so when you're doing some of these comparisons, or when you're looking at things, it really does become important. We understand what year they're starting from. With that in mind, let's look at some of the other problems with using CPI, you might want to say, or any index when comparing prices and things across time. Now, I just said that CPI does have some issues in using it, and there are three main issues of using this particular index, or any index you might want to say. One of the first big problems is what we say substitutional bias. Basically, when we are talking about changes in what's in that basket, the change in consumer demand is quite often not taken into account. So when we perhaps use a base year of 2011, think about the products that were available in 2011 versus the products that are available today. Maybe in 2011 it was a big thing to have an iPad, and today it's to have an iPhone. And is it have Androids come out to compete against the iPhone, and thus we have different demands. So when we look at this basket of goods, yes, the basket of goods does change from time to time, but remember, in the earlier basket, that item may not have been included, which then brings us to the introduction of new products. So here we, again, can use technology as sort of our beautiful examples. I don't know how many of you actually have one of those little iPods that were available. They were a big deal when they came out to listen to music through this iPod. Today, we have streaming services, and people aren't buying CDs. They're not buying these things because we now subscribe to a streaming service. So new services and goods can absolutely change consumer opportunities, which then again changes our basket, our base price basket. And thirdly is basically this unmeasured quantity or quality change? First of all, quality is hard to measure. What one person considers to be high quality, another person considers to be high quality are two different things. Also, how much value is actually changed based on that quality. Now, in this case, I'm using the example of flip phones versus the iPhones, and or smartphones, I should say. Um, Flip phones, they're not seen as having the same quality as basically the new smartphones are. But on the other hand, there are some people who still prefer flip phones. They're smaller, they're easier to carry, they're easier to maneuver. They don't have all the buttons and gadgets on them. If you just want to use a phone, they actually have really good reception, and you don't have a whole lot of stuff to mess with. So some people may find the flip phone superior to the smartphone who really just want a phone. They want to be able to put it up to their ear and hear something. And yet there are going to be other people who say, no, that flip phone doesn't give me all the buttons and whistles and bowls that I want in a single device. So quality becomes really hard to measure. And as cultures change across time, the quality that we demand will change. In some cases, we've been okay with going down in quality in certain products because we're much more interested in lowering the price. In other cases, we've had no choice. There's built-in expiration dates, you might want to say, to certain products that weren't there before. But if you want that product at this price, well, that part is only going to last for 5 years because of the amount of use. If we made it out of plastic versus making out of metal, but if we make it out of metal, it's going to be more expensive. So these are the three issues we always have when using any kind of an index, is how much change has there been from the base to the current in these three things. In the lecture that we just had, we talked about the gross domestic price deflator, which is basically looking at changes in prices for all goods and services produced within an economy. And we look at that versus CPI, the consumer price index. So they both reflect a different set of prices. But GDP is really looking at what's within the economy. So no imports are included in that. It also includes business and consumer goods, where CPI tends to only look at what consumers are purchasing in an economy. That means that that's also going to include imports, but it does not include businesses. It only looks at consumers. So we are going to see differences in CPI and GDP. Depending on what you're looking at would depend on which one you might want to do. They also weigh prices differently, meaning is that GDP deflator is currently looking at what is produced goods and services. So it records marketplace changes pretty quickly because what is produced within the economy can change month by month, year by year, where CPI is that fixed basket of goods. And that basket needs to be adjusted from time to time, but it's not generally adjusted as quickly as GDP is. So GDP deflator is going to give us basically a better indicator as far as what's happening in a shorter time period than CPI might as far as inflation is concerned. Now they both tend though to move in the same direction, and that's what you see right here. You know, they both move in the same direction, but they may show different reactions to what's happening in the marketplace. So one of the things you might notice is this one right here, where the CPI inflation really went up in 2010, but we don't see that the GDP went as much. And that's because the big difference with the 2008 Great Recession really tended to hit prices, not so much production. Now, production did take a hit. You can see it went way down, but a lot of this also tended to be housing. So it tended to be one industry that took some of the biggest hits, and also finance took a big hit. But agriculture didn't take such a hit. But because there was such a hit in finance, and this is the hit in finance, it really drove prices up because basically finance has to do with businesses. And what we do say is that when we look at CPI, we are looking at the prices we pay for things versus the productivity of the overall environment here. So you do notice it went up here and it went up here. That's what we mean by they tend to reflect, but we may see one is far more susceptible to that change than the other. So over here we see the same thing, but in this case we see the GDP go way up and we don't see prices go up so much. Why? Because basically it was not a really high inflationary period, but we got really productive. Something happened in 1994. Again, that's a history lesson, but it did occur. You may also notice that basically we have this big downward turn here. We got far less productivity, but we also see that prices came down. Again, there were all kinds of things that were happening at that time period that made for those adjustments. So we look at both because they both help us understand inflation, but it helps us look at inflation and changes in prices based on different aspects of the economy. They're not only national differences, but they're also regional differences in cost of living. And so the BEA does look at regional comparisons, one state to another. Now, what is important is to understand that the U.S. is set at 100, and you can see that here. And this is one of those things I talked to you about, is that we always want to know where the 100 point is. So they're comparing everything to this 100 from each state. But what that means is that they calculate it across the entire United States, and then they look at each state compared to what the 100 for the average across all of the United States is. So any number over 100 shows that it costs more than average to live in that particular area versus the average within the United States. So Hawaii at 119 is basically saying that 19.3% more than average to live there, whereas we could also see numbers below 100 show that it costs less. Now the only thing you have to do here is a little subtraction, but basically if we're talking about Mississippi, it costs 15% less to live there than pretty much the average location within the United States. Then you can look at things like Florida, my home state, which is at 101. So basically we're about 1% above average, but the closest to the most average, you might want to say, place would be Delaware, and that they're 0.06 less. So they're a little less. So right there where we see that cutoff right there, that is where sort of the average price is. What that means is that the salary that I make in Hawaii, if I was to take the salary I make in Hawaii and I was to go to Mississippi, I would be able to have a much higher standard of living in Mississippi, assuming that I was able to get the same wages as I got in Mississippi. But if I went from Mississippi and took the wages I got in Mississippi and I went to Hawaii, I probably wouldn't be able to live very well because there's an enormous difference in living standards and cost of living standards between those things. So even if I'm coming from Florida going up here, I would have to expect at least a 19% bump in my salary to be able to live at basically the same level that I'm living here in Florida. Or if I go from Florida to Mississippi, I should expect perhaps a bump down in my salary. But if I get a bump down in my salary, I may still have the same standard of living as I have in Florida based on the cost of goods. Due to inflation, we do see that there can be laws and contracts that automatically adjust, you might say, for this inflation through indexation. So as an example, Brian, our restaurant owner who buys potatoes from the farmer, within their contract there may be a clause that says that if inflation goes up by X amount of money, the price of the potato will automatically go up by X amount of money. Even though Brian may have contracted to buy the potatoes at $1 a pound, if in the contract it says that if it goes up by 10%, then the price of his potatoes will go up by 5%, then the cost of his potatoes would automatically go up to meet that contractual obligation. This is often done when we see long-term contracts. We also see that it's written into some laws. Example is Social Security. They have an automatic inflation calculation, and Social Security prices will, or paychecks you might want to say, but the price of the government for Social Security will automatically go up. By the way, this is called a COLA. Not what we're going to be drinking, but the cost of living adjustment. And the last place that we see these are sometimes in union contracts between employees and their employer, where automatic cost of living adjustments are included in their salaries. Now, again, this is usually a contract between unions and employers. You may not have a COLA within your employment situation, especially if you don't have a union. More than likely there probably is not a COLA within that. But these are words that you hear and that you see and are built into aspects of business and employment. So just a good thing to know about. Since we're talking about inflation in this chapter, we have to look at inflation and interest rates and see how those play out. Now we got Marco over here. Marco is about to graduate from school, and he says, I want to have this big old grad party. I want to have more than 50 people. And so what he has is he has $1,000. And he said, I think I'll put this in a certificate of deposit because right now they're going to give me 10% annual rate. And it's going to be a year before I graduate. So at the end of the year, I'm going to take this money out. And at the end of the year, he has $100 more than he had when he started. So he's got $1,100 now. So his question is, how many steaks can I buy? Because what he knows is that he only can invite the number of people that he has steaks for. And when he put his money in, steaks were $20. Now, if there's been zero inflation, this is great because now he could invite 55 people. Why? Because the cost of steaks are still the same. But what if there had been, let's say, a 5% inflation rate? Well, steaks have gone up to $21 now. And so now you can only have 52 people. Now, the reason I say no partial people is that if you do the division really fast, you'll notice that it's 52 point blah, 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 blah. Well, in reality, we can't invite a point something person. So 52 people, no rounding up in this case. What if inflation was maybe even a little bit higher? It had been 10% inflation. Well, now steaks are $22, and notice he can invite 50 people. Well, that's how many he could do before he started. 1,000 divided by $20 for the steaks is 50. So it's the same as a year ago. He basically was not ahead at all. In fact, if inflation had gone to 12%, which would be pretty high inflation, the steaks went to $22.40. Now he could only invite 49 people. He could actually have less people today than he could have before. Now, 10% is a really outstanding interest rate. I haven't seen a 10% certificate of deposit most of my life. Only when I was very young I saw that. And we had terrible inflation at that time. So let's cut that in half. Let's say instead that he earns 5% on a CD. Even that would be extraordinarily good these days if you could get 5% on a one-year CD for $1,000. You can find it. It's not risky. You might want to do it. Meanwhile, what would happen if it was only 5%? Well, we already know he's going to make less money. So now he's only going to make $1,050. Steaks are $20. But, at the end of the year, he can invite 52 people. So this is pretty good. What if inflation went up by 5%? Well, the steaks are still $21, but now he can only invite 50 people, the same as he had a year ago. So he didn't come out any better as far as purchasing power is concerned. Yes, he had $50 more, but remember, inflation, all the prices go up, so his purchasing power went down. If it went up by 10%, he's down to 47 people. If it went up by 12%, he's down to 46 people. So what this shows you is what we call a time value of money. That money has a different value today than it may have in the future, depending on inflation. Which brings us to a whole kind of way to look at inflation. We have to look at what we call nominal interest rates, and those are those advertised or stated rates on a loan. So in this case, the stated rate on the loan was 10%. That's what the bank was going to give him. But a nominal rate is not really what we're so concerned about. We're really concerned about what we say is the real interest rate. Now, the real interest rate is what is it that I'm actually going to be getting if we correct this for inflation. Now, there are two ways we can look at this. If we're looking at it from the nominal set, you can basically say, well, the nominal price is basically the real plus the inflation. Here's what we think it is, and here's our inflation premium, and this gives us our nominal rate. This is what you see being advertised out to you. The other way we can look at it is we can say, well, we can take the nominal rate, and this is what most people who are not in banking are going to do. If I'm sitting there and I'm looking at putting my money into a CD or buying a house, I'm going to take that nominal rate. I'm going to subtract what we believe is the perceived inflation rate coming forward, and that's going to tell me what my real rate of return is going to be, or at least what my expected rate of return is. Now remember, we don't know exactly what inflation is going to be. We can only get an absolute number after everything has occurred. But if I'm going forward in time, I can have an expected rate of return. as far as interest rates are concerned. So let's look at Marco's case. Well, at first he was getting 10%, and if there was no inflation rate, which is what we said originally, there was no inflation rate, his real rate of return was 10%. But then remember, the next time we had a 5% inflation rate. And so he was thinking he was going to get 10%, but inflation went by 5%. He really only got a 5% return. And you can already guess that when the third option that we showed, where he had a 10% inflation rate, he actually didn't get any return at all. Not when it comes to purchasing power. Now, yes, he got $100 more, but it costs more to buy everything. So in this case, the basket of goods cost him 10% more. So he didn't really get any more purchasing power. And what would have happened if it went up to 12%? He would actually have lost some purchasing power. He would be able to buy less today, even though he had more money than he could have when he started. So interest rates and inflation are kind of interesting. Those of you going into finance, you'll study this a lot more. But for those who are not going into finance, understand that when we talk about rate of returns, that you want to look and see, are they talking about the nominal or the real? What will happen quite often is people will try to sell you things on these nominal rates without you understanding what the real interest rate is, because they may know that there's some sort of inflation that's going to be going up. And there is that thing called an inflation premium that is basically put into every nominal rate. And you can't get rid of that. The question is how much is the bank or the person giving out the loan expecting inflation to go up? They want a correction for that. After all, I'm lending you this money. I want to make sure that at the end of this loan period, I have at least more than what I put in there. So I always think this is kind of an interesting topic to look at as far as how interest rates and inflation are affected. I hope you find this video helpful. If so, check out the other lectures that I have produced for my students that are open to anybody who needs to learn about economics. Until next time, keep learning.